Hello, my name is Sam, and in this video I will be discussing graphene nanocomposites. In the next about 10 minutes, I'll be answering the questions, what is graphene and where does it come from? What is a nanocomposite and why graphene nanocomposites are important? Let's start with the basics. What is graphene? Graphene is a molecule made out of carbon that has been formed into a sheet 1 atom thick. This is what it looks like at the atomic scale, where these dots represent the carbon atoms. This is what it looks like to us. It's a very fine, flaky, fluffy powder. It's also super black. So while a molecule of graphene may only be 1 atom thick, it may also be hundreds of micrometers wide. Well, how big or small is that? The human hair is about 100 micrometers wide and thick. So that doesn't seem very large until you consider that this is 100,000 times larger than the thickness of a single carbon atom, therefore the thickness of graphene molecules. If a graphene molecule were as thick as a human is tall, about 6 feet, it would stretch from Philadelphia to New York City, about 100 miles. This is something you need to keep in mind because it's one of the reasons graphene has such remarkable properties. Another one of the reasons is the very strong bonds between the carbon atoms. It's an sp2 bond, but all you really need to know is that the bonds between the atoms are very strong. This gives the molecule as a whole a lot of strength. It's actually hundreds of times stronger and stiffer than steel. The problem, though, is that the molecules are so small, it's hard to transfer load to and from them. Maybe you've guessed the solution, which is nanocomposites. We'll get into that in just one second, but first let's take a little bit of a look at how graphene is actually produced. And welcome to the lab. I wanted to just point out this machine here, which is where we make our graphene in the lab. We use thermal shock is the mechanism that creates the graphene. So first what we take is graphite, which really is just graphene stuck together in layers. And so we oxidize that, and so the oxygen gets in between the graphene layers, and so they start out like, let's say like this, and they spread a little bit, and weakens the bonds. They're pretty weak bonds with that large surface area, adds up to a lot of force anyway, so it weakens that bond, and so when you heat it up, it expands enough, and it puts enough energy in there to break apart, so now you have graphene. That's it. Hi, I'm glad you're with me so far, but let's stop for a second and talk about what exactly a composite is. Composite is a material that has been made from two or more other materials. So this is fiberglass. It's just glass fibers that have been woven together. It's not very useful, doesn't hold up on its own. But if you mix it with epoxy, you get this, which is obviously much stiffer, and it's also a lot less brittle than epoxy by itself. So you get a material that is superior to the other materials when they're by themselves. You can also add graphene to your epoxy fiberglass composite to get a hierarchical composite. So this is fiberglass, epoxy, and graphene. And that's what a composite is. Well, that was interesting. Let's get back to it. Alright, great. You know what graphene is, and you know what composites are. So let's talk a little bit about the advantages of graphene nanocomposites. Scientists put 0.1% graphene in epoxy, and they found that that combination, which is 1,000 to 1 epoxy to graphene, gave a 40% increase in strength, 30% in stiffness, and 50% in toughness. Now, that's not the only ratio you can put in, but that's pretty close to the optimal that's been found so far for graphene and epoxy. And this is an incredibly low ratio. Nothing else does this, not even close. And the reason such a small amount of graphene is required to have such a huge effect, which increasing the strength and stiffness of something by 30 to 40% is a huge change, is because of the massive surface area we talked about before. I told you to remember that, and this is why. You're getting huge surface area to volume for for a very small amount. So you don't need a lot weight-wise to get a lot surface-wise. And so that's why you have these huge changes. You can get increases like this from other sorts of nanocomposites, but you cannot get it at this loading at 0.1%. You need more like 1%, 2%, orders of magnitude different, even up to 20% for nanoclays. So since the fiber is what is really having all the strength, why is this important? Well, the epoxy does something in there. I don't want to get into it all, but it's really, a lot of it is this fracture toughness. It also does increase the strength, the stiffness of the overall composite, having the epoxy, and bending the epoxy is more important. So increasing the material properties of the epoxy does contribute overall, but it's just not a direct correlation, and that's something I need to caution you about. As you can see, one of the largest improvements from graphene and epoxy was this 50% toughness. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about how graphene actually toughens the epoxy. So if you imagine your part, you start to get a crack in it, and so let's say this is your part, and you have a crack over here. This is your crack. And you've got some load applied to it so that this crack will want to go this way, and so it'll start spreading as you cycle this load. It'll spread and spread and spread. But imagine, now let's zoom in on our crack. So this is the crack. So imagine you have graphene in your matrix now. What that can do, first of all, it can stop the crack. And so as the crack comes up to it, it sees this material that's much stronger than the epoxy, and it has to go around it. And going around that requires much more energy than if that wasn't there. So basically it blocks the crack and it deflects the crack. And this is how graphene toughens epoxy. So one of the reasons that only 0.1% of graphene and epoxy has such a large impact is because of the very large surface area to volume ratio that we talked about before. Well, thank you for watching my video. I hope you learned a thing or two about graphene nanocomposites. Have a good rest of your day or evening, weekend, whatever. I'll see you next time. Bye. So if you imagine for a second that a graphene molecule were as thick as a human is tall, let's say about 6 feet, that molecule would then stretch from New York City to Philadelphia, about 100 miles. That's not joking around, that's pretty large.